Top 10 China Books. That is, the top 10 books to help you understand China. In his 2007 book, The Curtain, Milan Kundera wrote of how authors are cursed with megalomania, reflecting on how while a mediocre plumber may be useful, a mediocre writer is contemptible. China, the land of Lao Tzu, Confucius, the Great Wall, and the economic miracle, has enough to appeal to anyone's inner megalomaniac. Here is a list of 10 books about China that have channeled this megalomania in a positive way and will help you get better acquainted with this amazing country. At 10, The Good Women of China by Xinran. Xinran made her name as a radio agony aunt in China. After moving to London in 1997, she began working on this book about some of the women she had encountered during her journalism career. Since the Civil War ended in 1949, China's treatment of women has improved drastically and has sometimes even compared favorably to developed countries. But it remains the nation in which foot-binding and concubinage existed within living memory, and these stories are a harrowing glimpse into the reality of the lives of women in China. At 9, Tao, the Watercourse Way by Alan Watts. The Tao Te Ching, written about 400 BCE, is one of the most translated and talked about texts in history. One of the great popularizers of this and Eastern philosophy in general is Alan Watts. A former Episcopal priest, Watts' book is packed with observations about the Chinese language and what the Tao Te Ching still has to teach about the modern industrial world. Realizing that the Chinese language has taken the same form for some 2.5 millennia, the book's conclusions include that Westerners should study the language as part of the curriculum, because of all of the major languages, it is the most different to our own, and therefore helps challenge assumptions that are held so deeply they are barely conscious. At 8, Life by Lu Yao. Anyone who has worked or studied in China will know that the modern language is often vague and verbose. In his sadly short life, Lu Yao became a literary superstar, appreciated for his stripped-down and lyrical prose. His debut novella, Life, about an aspirational country boy torn between two women, resonated throughout the transforming nation in the 1980s. Though unsentimental in its portrayal of poverty, it is suffused with a sadness at what was being lost as China embraced capitalism and commerce. At 7, The Three-Body Problem by Lao She. This outrageously ambitious science fiction thriller starts during the Cultural Revolution, a period of government-sponsored upheaval started in 1966, when protagonist Ye Wenjie's father gets beaten to death by Red Guards. In her capacity as a physicist and overcome with misanthropy, Ye Wenjie invites an alien invasion after receiving a mysterious message. The book has been garlanded with awards, praised by George R.R. Martin and Mark Zuckerberg, and described by Barack Obama as fun to read. At 6, China in 10 Words by Yu Hua. Yu Hua is one of China's most loved and accessible novelists of the past century. Many would cite his novel To Live as the more obvious choice for this list, but China in 10 Words is full of clever insights that all levels of China observer can learn from. The words include Shanzhai, copycatting, where Yu Hua argues that China's copycatting is a form of creativity, and Gemian, revolution, which draws parallels between Chairman Mao's disastrous Great Leap Forward and the construction boom of the early 21st century. At 5, The Good Earth by Pearl Buck. Born in China to missionary parents, Pearl Buck became the first American woman to win the Nobel Prize and a best-selling author in the early 1930s with The Good Earth. It is a harrowing portrayal of rural poverty and the feudal notions that still permeate China today. At 4, Factory Girls by Leslie Chang. Factory Girls is about the ordinary people who made the economic miracle happen around the turn of the millennium. The portrayal of their lives is neither relentlessly bleak nor fluffily optimistic. No sensationalism, no melodrama, just life. At 3, Out of Mao's Shadow by Philip Pan. Former Washington Post correspondent Philip Pan writes about the various categories of dissident he encountered. Pan acknowledges that the period since the 1980s has been, by most measures, the best in China's 5,000-year history, and the Communist Party deserves a huge chunk of credit for this. He takes a deep and historic dive into the overbearing corruption and lack of everyday morals at the heart of society. The introduction states, "A momentous struggle is underway for the soul of the world's most populous nation. On one side is the venal party state, an entrenched elite fighting to preserve the country's authoritarian political system and its privileged place within it. On the other is a ragtag collection of lawyers, journalists, entrepreneurs, artists, hustlers and dreamers striving to build a more tolerant, open and democratic China." Pan takes an in-depth look at these dissidents and their stories with breathless prose. At 2. Wild Swans by Qian Zhongshu. Published in 1991, this is a memoir by the author, accompanied by biographies of her mother and her grandmother. The lives of these three women take in the entirety of 20th century China and embody the enormous changes that it went through. The author's grandmother was a nameless concubine with bound feet. Her mother fought against the Japanese in the 1940s and for the communists in the Civil War, and the author herself was a Red Guard during the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s before being sent to the countryside, in what was described by J.G. Ballard as the brain death of a nation. Honourable mentions. But before we get to number 1, here are some honourable mentions. Books that, though no less great, are maybe slightly esoteric for this list. Diary of a Madman and Other Stories by Lao She. Lao She is one of the most important essayists of modern China, and Diary of a Madman is a biting satire of the feudal society of the first half of the 20th century. Rickshaw Boy by Lao She. Kurt Vonnegut suggested that in any story every character must want something, even if it's just a glass of water. The protagonist in Rickshaw Boy, Camel Xiangzi, just wants his own rickshaw, and in pursuing this desire, his story takes in the sweeping backdrop of early 20th century China. Fortress Besieged by Qian Zhongshu. A fortress besieged is a metaphor for marriage, in that everybody in wants out and everybody out wants in. Fortress Besieged is a comedy of manners and a romance. Red Rose, White Rose by Eileen. With an arresting opening paragraph, Red Rose, White Rose is an exploration of China's patriarchal society, told from the viewpoint of a man but written by a woman. And at number 1, The Incarnations by Susan Barker. Published in 2014, The Incarnations is a thrilling whodunit that spans over a millennium of Chinese history. It was described in The Independent as China's Midnight's Children, but is markedly more accessible than Rushdie's masterpiece. Most of the action is set in Beijing in 2008, a section which itself contains telling period details such as Nokia phones. But some of the most thrilling scenes are set in the distant past, as the protagonist and unnamed antagonist destroy each other over and over again throughout the centuries. As John Berger said of James Joyce's Ulysses, it doesn't lay claim to its grandiosity, it is impregnated by it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments below.